Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Chee-Tash. My name is Chris, and today we're going to be talking about Atomic Habits, the book by James Clear, continuing our journey through this book. Today, talking about Chapter 7, The Secret to Self-Control. If you guys remember last time, we discussed Chapter 6 on why motivation is overrated. We talked about if you really have choice in things. And we talked about how important it is to have an environment that is conducive to habits that you want. And if you are not doing habits that are beneficial to you, you might want to look at your environment and change that environment, change the context of where you do your activities. Famous study that we talked about in that chapter was the one at Massachusetts General Hospital, where they discovered that lots of people were buying soda. So they asked themselves, well, how do we get people to buy more water? Well, most of the soda sales were happening at the cash register. So instead of having soda up at the cash register, they replaced it with bottled water, and they saw bottled water prices, or not bottled water prices, but bottled water sales increase by like 25% or something like that. So it was just the environment, it was the context that you were in. If all you're surrounded by is smokers, then it's going to be hard to quit smoking. If you're just surrounded by junk food, well, it's going to be hard to maybe lose weight or eat healthier. So just some foods for thought. And with that, we'll just jump right into chapter 7, kind of a shorter chapter. And this chapter is going to actually be the last chapter of this first part of the book, which is all about the cue response and making it obvious. So to start off this chapter, James talks about an anecdote with the Vietnam War. And he talks about in 1971, there was two senators that traveled to Vietnam, and they were horrified at what they saw. The war's still going on. Soldiers are still fighting, and soldiers are becoming addicted to heroin. And the congressmen were horrified to find out that about 15%, more than 15% of soldiers were becoming addicted to heroin or heroin addicts. I know there's a difference between those two, but at least they were addicted to heroin, and lots had even just tried heroin. About 35% had just tried heroin. Obviously, kind of a destructive drug and a destructive habit. So they were very, very scared about this because, oh my gosh, you have these drug addicts, what if they come home and now all of a sudden our society and the fabric of our nation is ruined by all these drug addicted soldiers that are going to come back and just wreak havoc. And that's not at all what they found. So they conducted a study on when the soldiers who had used heroin returned home, almost 9 out of 10 of them eliminated their drug use. They didn't have the same problem as they did in Vietnam. Now, why is that? Well, in Vietnam, there was lots of cues that could trigger drug use. You're away from home. You're surrounded by firearms and violence that maybe you need to escape that violence. There's lots of cues or lots of triggers in an environment like that. Now, when you come home, those same cues are not there. And it's for the same reason why sometimes when you kick a habit or you kick a drug habit, you can successfully kick it by going to rehab and programs of that nature. But when you return back home, you're returning to the same environment in which you were doing the drugs. It's kind of piggybacking off of what we were just talking about in the introduction there, stemming back to chapter 6. The context here is the key. So yes, you go to a nice drug rehab facility that's clean, that's full of people wanting to get better, that's very positive, and it makes you better. It kicks your drug habit, but then you come back home to maybe a poverty-stricken lifestyle, single parent, not a very nice neighborhood, and you go back to using drugs. 90% of heroin users, says James, become re-addicted after rehab because the environment hasn't changed. And James has a nice saying here in this chapter. I think it's on one of my next slides. Is that nope, it's on this slide right here, is that habits can be broken, but they can't be forgotten. They can't be forgotten. So what do you do? Well, lots of people say you need to have discipline. You got to have discipline. You got to be motivated. But oftentimes those are the wrong words to use because it's not necessarily about being disciplined or motivated. And if you see people being disciplined or motivated, lots of times, actually maybe all the time, they're really not different than everybody else. But it often looks like that because disciplined people, quote unquote, motivated people, just spend less time in tempting situations. They spend less time in situations that are going to trigger those bad habits, and they create a more disciplined environment. It's not that necessarily they themselves are disciplined, which, don't get me wrong, you have to have some discipline and some willpower. Don't get me wrong, you do. But it's more so the fact that they are in a more conducive environment to the habits that they want. So like I said earlier, it's not that maybe a non-smoker is more disciplined than the smoker. It's just that they're spending way more time, in coffee shops, in study groups, and outside of the bar, they're going to church, etc. And, the smokers may be spending more time around other people who smoke. There's a more disciplined environment maybe with the non-smoker. So a lot of times what happens with these habits is there takes place this autocatalysis. It's kind of a funny word, but it's basically like a self-fulfilling prophecy, a self-feeding process. So what happens is you do the thing that you are trying not to do because you end up triggering the response anyways, even by not doing it. So a lot of word salad there, but basically check this out. You want to quit junk food. So you stop eating junk food for a day, but you feel crappy because all you've ate is junk food and junk food makes you feel good. So you quit junk food for a day. You go back to it the next day because you're feeling crappy and you want to feel good. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, like a self-feeding prophecy, a self-feeding process, rather. Same thing with smoking. Smoking is what you do to ease your anxiety. So you stop smoking. You become anxious by not smoking, or when you become anxious in a certain scenario, like, a stressful day at work, you go back to smoking because it's your stress relief. Habits are broken, but they're not forgotten. Whenever you put yourself back in that context, that brain auto-wiring, that auto-catalysis is going to take place. So how do you make this stop? Well, you do the inverse of this first law. And remember, the 4 steps. You got your cue, craving, response, and reward. So with the cue, you got to make it obvious if you want to get a good habit. So if you want to break a bad habit, you got to make it invisible. Make it invisible. So yes, willpower, super important. But over time, not overtime as in going into overtime. The football game is going into overtime. But over time, willpower is not the answer because it becomes mentally and physically very draining. What you need is a better environment. You need to make the habit invisible. And I know James gave like a couple examples here. So if you're, as an example, if you're spending too much time on money, on electronics, well, why don't you stop reading magazine reviews of the latest tech gear or watching tech reviews on YouTube. If you find you're playing too many video games, why don't you unplug the console and put it in a closet after each use, etc., instead of just leaving the console out. So hopefully you guys see where I'm going with that. It's a change in the environment. If you find yourself smoking every time you get anxious, well, find out, well, why are you getting anxious? You're getting anxious about work? Okay, well, why are you getting anxious about work? Oh, because you have too much, you've got so many demands. Well, okay, let's come up with a plan and let's really think about things and let's prioritize and see what can be actually needs to be done right now and what can be done later to ease that anxiety. So you're going after the context, not necessarily the habit itself. Make that habit invisible by changing the context. So to summarize, you want to stop a bad habit, right? Well, just invert the first law. So instead of make it obvious, make it invisible. Because habits can be broken, but they're not forgotten. It's the famous, I really like this phrase from this chapter and something that I think is just so true. So if they can't be forgotten, make it invisible. Put yourself in situations where that habit won't get cued. And again, it's not about self-control. It's about putting yourself in situations where you don't need to reach to that self-control. You don't put yourself in tempting situations to where you're going to break your habits. And lastly, self-control/discipline is a short-term solution. What you actually want to do, again, make it invisible. Self-control and discipline is great. You need it. But at the end of the day, it's exhausting and mentally draining. And you only have a certain amount of energy throughout the day before you need to recharge. You got a battery, just like everybody's got a battery. Some people got more juice than others, but yeah, at the end of the day, it's about that context. So make that habit invisible, change your context, change your environment. And that's going to do it, guys. Thank you very much for listening. We'll be back next time. Check out the podcast, the Chee-Tash podcast. Thank you guys so much. Like and subscribe. My name is Chris. This has been Chee-Tash. Take care, everybody.